Until the age of 28, I was a hardcore anti-Semite. I spread every lie and every conspiracy theory about Jews and about Israel. And yet, 15 years later, my most watched videos out there are about actually defending Israel. And the most emotional moment of my intellectual career was being gifted a little medallion by some Jewish people who lost loved ones on October 7th. But this video is not just my story. It's about how even the ugliest hatred can be unlearned. It's about what it takes for someone to change their mind and change it radically. Now, people, when I say that I was an anti-Semite, I mean it. I remember after 9/11, my very first reaction was not grief, it wasn't even shock. My very first reaction was that Mossad probably had something to do with it. This was the prism through which I viewed the world. Something bad happened, something big happened. Who could be beside it? Well, obviously, the Jews. And it would get worse. Because by 21, I was actually reading, literally, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the worst anti-Semitic conspiracy theory in history. And I still have the copy here. And I remember opening this book, and I remember being disappointed because in the introduction it mentioned that, well, this is probably debunked as a fake, that this book is a conspiracy theory. And the publisher, who is an anti-Semite, must have included this to avoid a libel case. But then in the very next paragraph, we read that whether the protocols are genuine or not, the plot described in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is happening in front of us out there in the world. And then I felt at home again. Because I took it as a confirmation that yes, my worldview, that there are these powerful Jews out there who control things and make bad things happen, this worldview was still legit. Another highlight of my anti-Semitism, I remember in 2006, during the Israel-Hezbollah war. I remember I was on vacation in Crete with some friends, and I remember that I wanted to find where is the local anti-Israel protest and to actually join. I had, how could I describe it? Fear of missing out. Anti-Israel fear of missing out. I didn't want to miss any chance to protest against Israel and to slam Israel. Of course, the irony is that I had zero idea where Lebanon was. I couldn't point it on the map. I didn't know what Hezbollah was, and I had no idea why they were fighting Israel. All I knew, though, was that Israel was involved, and therefore Israel had to be the bad guys. This was the given. And as I got older, my anti-Semitism only deepened. I remember around 2010, my Facebook profile picture was a cartoon depicting Israel as this octopus with its tentacles spreading and strangling its neighbors. As anti-Semitic as it can get. So I was so okay with this anti-Semitism, that I was okay that this was the first image the world would know about me. So if someone would connect with me on Facebook, the first thing they would see, okay, this is a guy who absolutely hates Israel. And things didn't get better when I moved to the United Kingdom. I actually recently found an old pamphlet from 2009. I'm not remember at what occasion of activism I collected it. But the title of the pamphlet is Hamas has offered peace. Hamas has offered peace. And it describes, quote, the pragmatic Hamas Prime Minister, Israel Haniyeh, as simply wanting an honorable deal for a two-state solution. That's the same, quote, pragmatist Haniyeh, by the way, you saw on October 7 in his luxury hotel in Qatar, celebrating and praying for the attacks. So these were my sources of information. This is where I drew my knowledge about Israel. And I know all this is disgusting. And trust me, no one is more disgusted by it than myself. But still, I don't think this is about me. This is about asking, why would someone like me, a middle-class kid from an educated, progressive family, how would he end up with such views? What makes someone an anti-Semite? And by the way, someone who I don't think I've ever met someone who was an actual Jew and I had any problem with them. I had no idea what a Jew did and where they congregated and what they did. I had no contact with any Jews as far as I knew. So why was I like that? First of all, let's be clear. People have free will. So the main culprit in this story was me. I was first and foremost to blame. And I'm not sure what were the psychological factors at play. Maybe at that stage, my life wasn't going anywhere. I didn't have much going for me. So instead of doing the difficult work, which would be asking, what am I doing with my life? I looked for someone else to blame. And blaming the Jews or blaming capitalism definitely felt easier than taking ownership of my life and then exercising some agency. But there were also cultural factors. Greece is a country where antisemitism has been everywhere across the political spectrum. On the left, of course, Israel is seen as an imperialist, capitalist outpost in the Middle East. On the far right, they hate Jews because that's what the far right does. But even I remember in ordinary household, I remember hearing things like from religious people mostly, like, the Jews are the ones who killed our Jesus Christ. And this atmosphere had an effect on me in my impressionable years. Later, I became active in the radical left. I was actually part of the youth of the Communist Party, and that shaped even more my identity. And of course, in these circles, hating Israel is a given. Hating Israel is part of the package. So in Greece, antisemitism was in the air. It was everywhere and it created this fuse: religious bigotry, anti-Americanism, and anti-capitalism. And to give you a precise example about what type of culture we're talking about. After 9/11, 1 in 4 Greeks, 1 in 4, thought that the terrorist attacks were justified, that they were blowback, as the libertarians would put it. And only 4 people among Greeks, only 4% supported a US retaliation, the US finding who was behind it and attacking them. This was a percentage lower even than in Pakistan. There were more people in Pakistan who thought that the United States should retaliate against 9/11 rather than in Greece. Greece was also the country where Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was treated as a celebrity in the 80s and in the 90s and in the early 2000s before he died. He was an honored guest at conferences of the ruling Socialist Party. And Palestinians were seen as the underdog, as the freedom fighters. Like we Greeks, weren't we also the freedom fighters fighting as underdogs for our independence during the years of the Ottoman rule? We were told the equivalent are the Palestinians. And in a world of comfort, a world of materialism where no one anymore stood for anything, the Palestinians looked like the modern day Davids, standing up to a Goliath, which was Israel. A Goliath backed by the global elites. So the Palestinians were alone, so we had to be with the Palestinians. So it's no wonder then that I remember one of the first posters I ever put up on my bedroom was, when I stopped putting posters of football players, was that famous iconic photo of the Palestinian kid, I think his name was Faris Sodeh, throwing that rock in the tank. And that photo, it felt heroic. It felt right that yes, these people are the right side of history. But here's an irony. Although I was so emotionally invested in all this, I knew, again, absolutely nothing about the conflict. I couldn't tell you the difference between the West Bank and Gaza. I didn't know what's the difference between Hamas and Hezbollah. I was just soaking up all this vibe that here we have the weak side and the weak side is the good side. So my support for the Palestinians was this strange cocktail. Part of it was idealism, and I think there was something, although completely mistaken in the historical context, there was something healthy there. But there's no question that part of it was bigotry. And part of it was a complete unwillingness to think for myself. So the culture made antisemitism easy. But of course, at the end of the day, the blame was for me, for not caring about figuring out the facts of reality in this case. But that's what happens when you are what Ayn Rand called a second-hander, someone who doesn't think for himself, but just passively absorbs. So in a culture like Greece, in a country like Greece, if you just wait and absorb what the culture gives you, the result is you will end up what I was, someone who believed stupid and bigoted and horrible stereotypes. So that was my life till I was probably 28. So how did all this then change? And there is no big lightning bolt moment there, because such transformations usually take time, and such transformations usually begin with small cracks in the worldview that you have. There's a small erosion here, one small crack there, and then one another, and then eventually your whole worldview at some point collapses. And it was around 2013 when I started questioning my leftist beliefs. It was around that time that I discovered the Austrian School of Economics. And this was very important because suddenly I had all the answers that I couldn't find in Marxism. And it was around that time that I discovered Ayn Rand. And I got this very positive, heroic, humanist view of life, a view that I couldn't find on the left. And yet, Israel was the very last piece of that puzzle, that the last thing that I questioned from my previous beliefs. Because by that point, I had admitted to myself that many of my beliefs were wrong, or at best incomplete. So at some point I thought, what if the same thing is true about Israel? But because at that point I was mostly a libertarian, that's how I viewed myself. So the transition was from Marxism to libertarians. And most libertarians are hostile to Israel. They still are today and they were back then. So I would still be the recipient, let's say, of information that viewed Israel as a hostile, as a power hostile to peace. Also, libertarians, they're against the so-called neocons, and the idea was the United States is fighting Israel's wars. So at that point, again, not much change in terms of how I viewed Israel. I wasn't anymore an anti-Semite, so I wasn't obsessed with Jews controlling the world, but neither was I pro-Israel. I said, look, the Jews as people, treat them as individuals, but that particular state, Israel, it has a lot to answer for. It has this very dirty history filled with blood and with aggression. And yet, month after month, more doubts continued to creep in. So at that point, because I thought I would pay a bit more attention to what was happening there. I was, by that time, finishing my PhD. I was working at university, so I thought I need to be a bit more informed about what is happening to the world. And I had realized that clearly now the leading force in the Palestinian movement was radical Islam, obviously with Hamas in Gaza being the best example. And this was also the time of the Charlie Hebdo attack, and also the time of the Bataclan massacre. So I viewed radical Islam as a threat. Obviously, this made my view of the conflict shift a bit. Because now it wasn't so clear that the Palestinians are all freedom fighters and Israel is the aggressor. So at that point, my conclusion became, I'll actually stay agnostic. Who knows what's happening there? They're probably both bad. I mean, they've been fighting forever. God only knows who's right and who's wrong. The one side has radical Islamists, jihadists, the other side imperialism. That conflict is not for me. But I was actually very close to the biggest shift in my view on the topic. And this biggest shift can be summed up in two words. And these two words are facts and history. It was actually getting a bit more accustomed, almost by coincidence, to the history of the conflict that made me view it in a drastically different light. So I've always had this intellectual curiosity. Whenever I get into a topic, I want to hear it from the horse's mouth. So for example, when I was studying the conflict from the point of view of someone who wants to see both sides, I got access to some very rare sources, as this booklet, from example, from the 1970s by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. I don't think that there are many people who have something like that. Or when I study fascism, for example, I go actually and I read Gentile and even Hitler himself. I want to know what the most fervent advocates of that side are saying. So when it came to Israel, I went to an Israeli friend and I asked him, give me a book that really makes the case for your side. Like, send me your best. And that friend handed me an old book by no other than Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, this book was written decades ago, before Netanyahu was the person who is today. And the book was called Durable Peace. Durable Peace. Now, obviously, reading a book by Israel's current prime minister, that wasn't going to convince me. This is not why I changed my mind. But it was the first time when I was reading that book that I came across arguments that I found so outlandish that I felt I had to go and double check them. Because I was convinced that this is Netanyahu, these arguments which I've never seen before, this obviously must be Zionist propaganda. Here's one such argument that had a big effect on me. That Israel is actually tiny. That Israel is actually a very small country. I know it sounds obvious, but actually the book opens with comparing Israel to the Arab world, simple as, let's say, size. And the Arab states together, they're about 500 times the size of Israel. And here's the thing. After all these decades of being so strongly opinionated on Israel, I actually bothered for the first time to look at an actual map. And turns out that Israel is only about 65 kilometers wide on average. And actually, if you remove the West Bank, in its original borders, it's just 16 kilometers wide. 16 kilometers. And I thought, how had I never realized that? Because this means, the fact that Israel is so small, it means that there's a massive existential risk that this country is facing. If you know anything from military theory, there is zero strategic depth there. Which means one military defeat can be the last defeat for Israel ever. So I realized, you always thought that Israel was the Goliath, but there's no Goliath there. There is no David versus Goliath battle there. And then came the next bombshell. The next thing I never heard and I couldn't believe. That in 1948, 5 Arab armies invaded this tiny state on the first day of its existence. The Arabs invaded Israel? I thought it was the opposite. That couldn't be true. So literally first thing I go is I check Wikipedia, War of 1948. It turns out that was true. And then I discovered that there was a partition plan and the United Nations had offered to the Palestinian Arabs a state, and actually in quite good conditions in terms of the type of land they got. And the Arabs rejected it, and they chose instead to try to throw the Jews into the sea? How come no one had ever told me this? How is it that I didn't know all these things? But there were more surprises to come. I always thought the occupied territories, there was a Palestine there, and then Israel took it. But the occupied territories were not Palestinian before 1967. They were under Arab control for decades, and yet the Arabs did not bother to create this Palestinian state. And then these Arab states in 1967 again go at it, trying to wipe Israel out. And that's how Israel got the West Bank and Gaza? What? And then in 1973, turns out the Arabs attacked Israel again? Actually, I didn't want to believe it. Wait, so you're telling me that so many times Israel is on the defense? And then the biggest thing I couldn't believe. When Israel made peace with Egypt, they gave huge amounts of land back to Egypt. I thought Israel is imperialistic. How can an imperialist give back land? And again, I literally didn't want to believe it. I was saying this comes from Netanyahu. There can be no more biased source imaginable. But then I went and cross-referenced. I remember I spent time reading Britannica. I dug through mainstream sources. I went back to my university books on the conflict that I've never bothered to read. And turns out all this checked out. But then the biggest shock was still waiting, and it came into this second round of rabbit hole research on the topic. Apparently the Palestinians had been offered statehood not once, but at least in 5 different occasions. And every time the Arabs say no. My entire life I had believed the opposite, that Israel was the reason why there was no Palestinian state. And again I was wrong. So by around 2018, by that time I was 35, the shift was almost complete. I didn't hate Israel anymore. In fact, I started to see that Israel had some very legitimate claims in the long Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, I wouldn't go out of my way to defend Israel at that point, but I was no longer neutral. I was sympathetic to Israel because I also felt a bit guilty. Like all these years I was believing these things and I was espousing these things that were not true. Now this was the time around 2018. I was also diving a bit deeper into Ayn Rand and the objectivist movement. And it was through objectivism that I first heard a defense of Israel that actually clicked with me. Because this idea that, we should defend Israel because it's because of ancient history or because the Jews deserve a promised land. And now, none of that ever resonated with me. Actually, I'm an atheist and I don't pick sides in a conflict based on tribal allegiance and who was there 1,000 years ago. I don't care, to be honest. But what clicked for me, and this was again an approach by some objectivist thinkers like Elan Journo, what made sense to me was this, that Israel is worth defending mostly because in this conflict, it is the one society in the region fundamentally geared, let's say, towards life. What does this mean? That the goal is that men and women, Jewish, Arab, Christians, black, white, who live in Israel, they are allowed to pursue their happiness, their dreams, and their values. Of course, with caveats. For example, I never agreed, I can understand it, but I cannot agree with the obligatory military draft. But big picture is that at its best, Israel is a society oriented towards people being allowed to live a good life. Whereas its enemies, and particularly the religious fundamentalists, they seem to be more oriented towards death and towards destruction. Therefore, when you have this conflict between these two societies, it is actually worth supporting the society oriented more towards life. But you know what? And this is important in terms of how you communicate a message. All this was still a bit too abstract. I mean, I understood it. Yeah, the one's out is more towards life. But what made it real for me, what spoke to my emotions and to my heart, were the stories. Were some absolutely magnificent and heroic stories. For example, I remember when I was first reading about Israel's rescue of the Ethiopian Jews in the 1980s from Sudan. So Mossad agents, they were using every ounce of ingenuity to rescue the persecuted Jews from Sudan. And these operations were so daring that they even became a film. The title is something like the Red Sea Diving Resort or something. But the moral of the story for me is that we leave no one behind, no matter how impossible the odds. And that really inspired me. That I found this so fascinating, that here's a society that says that those of us who expect our protection, they will get it no matter what, even when it looks impossible. But the story that really captured my heart, my imagination, was Operation Edebe. What's that story? In 1976, some Palestinians and leftist terrorists hijacked an Air France plane and took it all the way to Uganda. And the hostages, they were surrounded by armed guards. They were protected by a hostile dictator, by a completely crazy guy who was an open admirer of Hitler. And yet, what does Israel do? Israel sends its commandos, a special unit, 3,500 kilometers away into enemy territory to rescue these hostages. And they stormed the airport, they killed the terrorists, and they freed the hostages. And every Israeli soldier made it back, except one. The leader of that mission, Yoni Netanyahu, the brother of Israel's current prime minister. And that story touched the most inner part of my heart. Because again, what kind of people fly a continent away to save their own? What kind of country takes that risk? And this is what fighting for life means to me. And Yoni Netanyahu actually became an obsession for me. I read every account of the Edebe raid. I watched every documentary I could find. I remember one night staying up almost all night trying to find anything I could find. Because to me, he was a larger than life figure. This is what a real hero looked like. Not because he died, I mean, this makes it more emotional, but for the action that he took, for saying, we can do that and we will do this. We will not let this injustice go unpunished. Because at the end of the day, this is what we all dream of when we're kids, right? This is what we're role playing, that we fly to faraway dangerous lands to save the innocent and to fight against the impossible odds, to fight against something that looks impossible until we do it. So from then, Israel wasn't just a misunderstood country for me. It became in my eyes something more. It became in my eyes a land of modern heroes. It became a place where the question isn't, oh, how many are the enemies? No. The question is, where are the enemies? We're going to face them. A place where the question isn't, can we save our people? The question is, how are we going to save our people? And maybe part of that spirit became related to something else Israel related that I became obsessed at that time, which is Krav Maga. Because I didn't just see Krav Maga as a martial art. I saw it as the Israeli spirit concretized. Do everything to try to avoid the fight, but when you're in danger, fight hard and fight with all that you've got. So at that point, my sympathy for Israel, in my late 30s, my sympathy for Israel had become something more. It had become fascination, and it became an admiration. And here an important question is, okay, but what about the Palestinians? After all, wasn't my hatred for Israel supposedly on behalf of the Palestinians? So how do I view about Palestinians now? Well, here's an uncomfortable truth. That back then, when I was an anti-Semite, I didn't actually care about the Palestinians because they were just an avatar for my hatred. They were just like these props on a stage. Actually, if anything, I probably wanted more of the Palestinians to be victims. I wanted more of them to become martyrs. Why? So that Israel would be hated even more by the world. Is this truly caring about the Palestinians? I don't think so. So paradoxically, I would say that today, I care more about Palestinians than I ever did in a way. Because today I truly care about the innocent Palestinians, about the children, about those who want to live in peace. And that's precisely why I side with Israel against the rulers of Gaza and of the West Bank. And I realize this is such a hard pill to swallow for many. If someone had told me this in my earlier years, that I care about the Palestinians and that's why I want the rulers to lose, I would say this makes no sense. And yet it does. Because how could you say you care about someone and yet you're indifferent to them living under theocrats? How can you care about someone and not care if they get jailed or tortured or killed the moment they step out of line? So the truth is that I would want, of course, the just grievances of the Palestinians, because they do have some just grievances. I want them to be met. And I would want the Palestinians at some point to have their own state. But this would have to be a state committing to defending individual rights. And individual rights for everyone, irrespective of which tribe they're part of. And such a state would be peaceful, and such a state would be worthy of our solidarity. And here's my final point, but I think it's an essential point. Our allegiance should not be to a tribe. For me, it's not the Jews versus the Palestinians. My allegiance is to the people who want to live free, the people who want to flourish. And actually, thought experiment. If one day in the future, Israel were to become more like, let's say, Putin's Russia, if Israel becomes a society of repression, a society wanting to conquer its neighbors, and if Palestine were to become a beacon of liberty, then my allegiance would be with the Palestinians. Because I hope I will always be with the people who choose life, with the people who choose life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to put in these simple terms, regardless of their tribe, of their nation, or of their religion. So coming to the end, I was actually thinking today that it's almost by accident, it's weird that my two most quote-unquote viral videos I've ever made, they're both about Israel. Although Israel is not my academic specialty, and I rarely comment on the conflict. And part of it is timing. They came out after October 7, although the one was a talk I did months before the attacks. But maybe there's something else that made these videos, appealing. That when something is touching your core at that deep level, you speak about it almost at a different energy, with a different fervor. Because you want others to see what you missed seeing for so long. So maybe every time I talk about Israel, without realizing, it's like a moral scream. Don't be that guy who I was. Don't do the mistakes that I did. Don't fall for the ignorance that I had. And maybe this is why I got so emotional, and I still get, with this Bring Them Home Now little medallion that I got from some Jews who have suffered dearly from antisemitism. They gave this to me some months ago in Australia. And it means so much to me because it makes me a bit more aware also about this journey. This from the dark place of anti-Semitism, from the dark place of conspiracy theories and of hate, to now standing loudly and proudly in solidarity with those who have paid a heavy price for such hate. So here's the takeaway then from all this journey, the journey from hate to understanding. The takeaway is that people can actually change. People can actually come back even from the darkest, from the most irrational beliefs. But people can come back from this darkness only if they are exposed to better ideas. So I didn't change because someone shamed me, because they called me Antisemite. I mean, they should have called me that, but that's not why I changed. And I didn't change because someone showed me videos with atrocities, or it wasn't any of these things. I changed because I encountered better ideas and better ideals. It's because I encountered people and stories and a narrative that awoke in me something higher, that awoke in me something good. So at the end of the day, don't give up on trying to reach people. Because you never know which story, which reference, which conversation, which small act or which small act of kindness might plant the seed of doubt in someone else's mind. A mind which now might be filled only with hate and prejudice. And actually, I judge from my life. My life turned because some people at some key points in my life, there weren't that many, but they existed, they didn't give up on me. But actually they challenged me and they saw me as a mind that could potentially be reached and a mind that could potentially be changed. And one last thing. A positive vision is always stronger than just opposing a negative. Again, what finally cured my antisemitism was admiration. Admiration for courage. Admiration for heroism. Admiration for the love of life that I saw in the story of Israel. And that positive, heroic vision was the final, let's say, disinfectant to my hatred and to my antisemitism. So if this story shows one thing, it is that hate isn't necessarily destiny. Bad ideas can lose to better ideas. A dark vision of death and a dark vision of hatred can actually be defeated by an inspiring vision of life. Thank you for watching.